Greetings. This is a retake of webinar 151 using table break calculations as separate thread. The original recording was kind of poor because for some reason the Google Hangout would not let me share my screen with all. So you were seeing a very small version of the screen coming and going. So this should be much easier to view, and we will also cover some points that were kind of skipped over or not brought up during the original webinar. The key points we want to do is why you would have to use an intermediate table with breaks for reporting, and then look at how the data table is defined and the break totals defined. Then we will look at the data sources and why there are two queries on SQL Server table when the application is primarily a high-profile client-server application. Then we will look at the use of a separate thread to allow background processing so that the parent application can continue to run and be useful if there's a large amount of data to be processed. Then we'll cover how the report from the table can use filtering to limit what rows get actually put in the report without regenerating the data table. And since we have a thread, we will also cover how to stop the thread processing safely. And we will look at the processing times and some sample runs. By the way, the times display in the original webinar was off by a factor of 10, and I'll explain why. The primary reason for this intermediate table processing is that we are looking at several visual manufacturing SQL Server tables with outer joins, because the primary data source is inventory transactions, and they have different related data depending on the type of transaction. So it complicates the reports, and we're totaling for that type of transaction, two different sets of totals. We tried it first with a standard report for a large set of data, and it was too slow. It would run out of memory and crash. And then if you made minor changes in the selection, you had to regenerate the complete data with another long runtime. Also, the report processing would prevent use of the application. So you had to run a separate application or two instances of the application. Then the desired break totals for each part that we were, which the report is based on parts, were unreliable and difficult to create. Then on top of that, when you did the preview presentation, it would take a long time and the print would regenerate the pages again. The solution was to generate a table in the selection window and print from the table. Now let's look at the two reports. The bottom report, the plain report, is the old report, which contained the queries in the report. You can see the data source is a query, and we'll look at that later. If you look at the code, you'll see that there's yet another query, second query called in here in the data reading portion. That was what made things really slow. Now, in the current one, the data source is a table in the selection menu window, which we're going to look at momentarily. And the code for that is strictly some filtering that we'll explain later. And the parameters are passed to report, indicating what filtering wants to be done, and the defaults are null so that no filtering occurs. Next, we want to look at the table that drives the report. The client needed additional calculations on each inventory transaction, such things as profit percentages, averages, and totals by type. The data table is based on the primary query, which we'll look at in the next section, and the break is on part ID. There are many break total fields. We tried to update those totals in the row display code, but it turned out to be very slow and unreliable. Finally, we did a loop through the table using table break subscript. Looking at the menu, this is expanded so that we can see the break totals more clearly. These are all the break totals here. This is just the static that is linked to the part ID for the header. And this is the rest of the break totals. And at the very end is set up and run hours, which comes from the secondary query. The table definition is strictly the query, the primary query that we'll look at next. And the break on the part ID. Now, everything in this window that is above this line are the parameters for the primary query. And when you click on the Generate button, then it will execute that query and enable the cancel generate. Then the generate also calls a routine to update the totals. Once the update is complete, then the print report button will become active. Generate is clicked again. Let's do a quick test on this report, on the table. We have some parameters here for just a very short period of time. And let's make this a little longer. March. Now let's run a quick test on this. We have a date range that will be reasonable here. And you see that it's updating the rows down here. And I put out a message, just kind of a progress bar type thing without a progress bar. And the query took 2.8 seconds. It's still updating the number of rows. And if we go down to the end, you can actually see that it's updating. There you see it go through there. The ding says that it's finished. So the processing of the totals took 31.17 seconds. The data sources are, like I said, two SQL tables. The primary is inventory transactions. It has two types. And one is kind of receiving materials for manufacturing, and then issuing the manufactured parts is the type I. Numerous selection parameters, but the primary is the date range and the customer ID, which is stored in the part table as a user-defined field. It allows us to select parts by customer ID. This primary one has two outer joins, and we'll look at that. There are some transactions related to customer order lines, and those require profit percentage calculations. It's done in the calculation field. And some transactions have a work order, which requires a second query to get the hours for setup and run of the labor ticket. This is the primary query, and as you can see, this join has multi-field relationship, and it is an outer join. Same here, just less number of fields. So if we look at the query definition, we do the profit percentage calculations in this field. You can see that. And it's just takes and does a standard profit calculation of times quantity minus cost times quantity and dividing by the quantity times 100%. If there is a quantity, that has to be put in there because there are several parts that do not have quantities in this field. If we look at the SQL code, you'll see the outer joins. Left outer join on the work order and left outer join on the customer order line here. These are the two outer joins. So now if we go back and look at the second query, this is where it picks up the labor tickets from the multi-field join here. But it just picks up the labor tickets based on the work order parameters. And then it sums the total hours. So you have a sum field here of labor ticket hours worked. And it includes the type, which is either set up or run. So that's where the data comes from. Even with the calculations in the table, we had the processing very much improved, but it would still stop the other windows in an MDI application. So we decided to put the processing of the totals and the building of the table in a separate thread. And the selection window, which I pointed out, has the query parameters that generate buttons, sets the query parameters, and then does a thread execute. A cancel button was put there in case it was a long calculation and there was a change in the queries, or they decided that they didn't want to take that long. And if you change any query parameter field, it automatically executes that cancel button, which stops the thread, doing a stop thread. And then messages show the progress of calculations. Again, this is the generate table button, and there's a button for resetting all the selections as well. And then below the line is the print, which we'll get to in a bit. So let's look at the code, the generate code. And that basically clears the table, cancels any previous query call, and displays the empty table. Then it goes through all the parameters. It also builds a selection string, which puts in the report heading what selection criteria was used to drive the report. And this is fairly standard stuff. If the parameter is specified, it adds that information to the selection string. And all the edit field and parameter fields are set to return null if empty. And so once that is done, then here's the thread execute, which starts the building of the data table, which is in this routine. So if we go to it, you can see the first thing it does is gray that generate button and the print button, and makes the cancel button active and puts a duration parameters up on the screen just for test information. So then the query is executed and the times are set. Interesting, time difference and date time difference both return hundredths of seconds, but the duration to string requires milliseconds. So you have to add this 0 to the time difference to make it display in the correct format. So if there is any rows in the table, then it does a table sort just to make sure it is by part ID. And then, which it also is in the query that way. But it sets the start time for totals and puts out the message saying we're updating R and I totals. And this code is what we used to have in the row display, and it just did not work well that way. So we get the table break row from the break footer part ID. And using that, we go loop through as long as the row is for the same part ID. Whenever it changes, we clear the total fields to make sure nothing is left over from a previous data run. And then we start updating the quantities and so forth and doing the calculations required for each total field. And if there is a work order, which means there's something in the work order base ID field, then we set the parameters for calling the secondary query and execute it. Then we loop through and add the hours to either the R totals, the run totals, or the setup totals. And then we cancel that declaration for the secondary code. And then the multitask here allows the screen to be redrawn. And finally, time and duration is put on the screen. So let's run a quick test of this. And when we click on the generate table, and let's expand this for easy viewing, you can see that the query has ended and the table has data, and now the totals are being updated. So if we go down to the end, you'll actually see the totals come and display when we get down to this range of the report. And now if I cancel, then it enables the generate again. Data doesn't go away until you click the generate. Plus, if you do the generate and it's running, then, and you decide that, oh no, I want actually 4 months. Okay, then it automatically cancels the processing, re-enables the generate. So there's no problem with changing that. So let's go back to okay, and now we generate. This time we won't interrupt it. And you saw the totals updating at the beginning, and then when you get down to the end, you'll see them come down through the page. And I put this message at the bottom so that the person, if they're watching this screen, allows it to know that it's it is making progress and roughly how long it'll take to finish. You saw the totals come down through the page. Next, we want to look at how report filtering helps this process. We can select certain rows out of the data and not print all of them by doing a filtering that is passed to the report. We saw that a little bit when we were looking at the report code. The selections that can be done on the table were things like only showing parts that have a certain profit percentage range, or eliminate those transactions with no cost because they're a type of material that have zero profit. There's an option to show only losses, and there's also an option box that controls the type of output. The nice thing is that the report can be run multiple times with different filtering for different outputs without regenerating the data. This is our selection menu, and as mentioned before, everything above the blue line is parameter selection for the primary query. That builds the data in the table, but all the selection that's below the line, the profit percentage from and to, exclude zero, only negative profit, those selections can be changed and the process rerun. So you can pick certain ranges of report, and we'll show that in a moment. The other selection in the print area is what type of output. The PDF puts it into a temp.pdf file in the current directory and then opens the PDF. If you do preview, that's the standard WinDev preview report, and it's slow because it generates the pages on the fly. And then when you print from it, it regenerates those pages. Or you can print it directly to the printer once you know that it is what you want. So let's look at the print code. There's a validation check to make sure there is something in the table to print. And the group selection state is grayed, and that prevents running this while the report is up on the screen. The switch there puts what kind of output there is, and then it calls the report. All three selections use the same report call. It's just a different output destination. In the PDF, you see there's also the shell execute that opens the PDF after it's created. So we'll look at these. And then once the report is run, it enables the selection buttons again, or the selection fields. But the other thing I wanted to point out was the duration time there. The calculation takes 27.24 seconds. So now if we hit the print, you'll see this passes the selection that says what the date range was, the customer ID, and all the parameters specified on the primary one, plus the filtering information. And this is the minus 500 from and the 2 percentage. And this is the false on exclude zero and false on negative only. Well, that shows you how we do the filtering. One of the other features of this report is that at the end of the update loop, it puts the menu back on top of anything else that's going on and gives a beep which they may or may not hear, but they don't have to sit there and watch the processing. And the cancel button does stop a thread. However, if you close the window during the update processing, you will get an error because it's still trying to update the table. So the solution is to execute the cancel button in the window close code, and you won't have that problem. Now I'd like to demonstrate how that signaling of the report completion works. So we start the report going here, and let's make it a little big. And we've got a reasonable time period there. So we generate the table, and then we come over here and we do a search while it's processing, and we look at various things. We're trying to find somebody. So now you want to refine your search, and let's say state code Oregon. None found, so close. And let's go do another search. Now it's complete, and it put that window on top of what I was doing. And it beeped, which you should have heard. And let's just show that if you're generating and you decide, oh, I don't want to do this right now, and you close it, it doesn't have a problem. And like I've already mentioned, I had found that I had an error in the original webinar showing the duration calculations incorrectly. And I explained earlier that that was because the time difference and our date time difference both give hundreds of seconds, whereas the duration to string expects milliseconds. So that was the formatting. That's fixed in show. So now let's look at some large samples of data and timing. And now we're running in an installed mode. So we have run this for an entire year of data with no selection criteria. So there are a total of 16,630 inventory transactions in that year. And you can see the query time was 2.59. It varies very little from one call to another. But it took 15 minutes and almost 27 seconds to update the totals in this table. And I've got the same filtering range in here that we tested before. So let's see what the report produces. It does take a little longer to produce the PDF with that many rows and pages. So it produced 33 pages of parts that had a loss or a very low margin. And it is something that they would study and try and figure out why these things, particularly things with large losses. And sometimes it's just the nature of that type of part that is used in something else. Anyway, the report does work. And again, let's just see if we add a customer criteria here. And now you notice as soon as I put that in, the print button, you can't go do the print again. So you have to generate, and over the same time frame, there's only 1,903. So that's going to take a bit. And so let's cancel and put a new date range. And as soon as I put a date range in here, it cancels the report processing and enables the generate button again. So now we'll have a reasonable time. Same query time roughly, with only 288 records. So that's basically all I have to cover. And so in closing, I just want to say thanks to WxLive and Tim for hosting these webinars. And thank you for viewing or viewing again if you watched the original one that was fairly difficult to watch. Any questions, comments, or suggestions would be greatly appreciated and can be sent to jeff@accmeals.com.